I'm Allan Stokes, Director of Environmental Programs with the National Pork Board. Two principal effects. First of all, in drought conditions, as most farmers know, you can see very large cracks appear sometimes in the soil. These large cracks actually set up what's called a preferential flow path, where manure or anything that you put on the ground, rather than taking time to absorb through the soil, kind of has an express route straight down to shallow groundwater or drainage tiles if you're in that part of the country where drainage tiles are used, and of course expedites the movement of manure that you want to stay on the ground for its good agronomic purposes to waters where you don't want it to be. The second major change is sometimes during droughts, because it obviously has negative impacts on the crops themselves and growing crops, the crops may not take up the manure nutrients or other nutrients that have been applied to the soil at the start of the cropping year. So it's very possible that you might have a higher concentration of residual nutrients in the soil than you would normally expect in a normal cropping year. Before applying to drought, well, before applying to any soils, but it's especially important for drought-impacted soils, a producer is going to want to thoroughly review their current manure management plan. Hopefully every producer has one that's updated. If not, they're encouraged to get an updated manure management plan. Understand what that plan calls for in terms of future cropping plans, fields that are to receive the manure during this particular cycle, and other aspects of the manure management plan, just so that they know what needs to be followed to stay in compliance with that plan. Second, thoroughly scout the fields that are identified for manure application for the presence of cracks, and I'm talking a fairly thorough scouting of the fields across the entire field area that's intended. If possible, avoid manure application on severely cracked fields, but if that's not possible, and it often is not, that be prepared to take some additional steps in terms of preparing a soil profile to receive the manure. And then third, certainly producers are encouraged to always do soil testing to know what the levels remain of nutrients in the soil, but it's especially critical in drought years where crops may have been impacted to the point that they've not taken up as much of the previously applied nutrients, and you may have higher residual levels of nutrients remaining in the soil than what would normally be expected in a normal cropping year. During manure application, they'll want to keep in mind that they may very well need to do some pre-working of the soil before manure application. If it can't be avoided in terms of putting manure on ground that showed signs of rather serious and deep cracks, the producer is going to want to pre-work that soil to a depth of 3 to 5 inches, if you will, to kind of establish a sponge or a consistent base of soil to accept the manure, to allow the manure to absorb into the soil and stay in the soil profile where you want it, as opposed to going down the deep cracks, as I mentioned earlier, that have established a preferential flow path and serve an expressway for the manure to get down into shallow groundwaters or drain tiles where you don't want it. So they'll want to pre-work the soils. They'll also want to very seriously consider reducing the application rate during any one pass, and perhaps applying the manure on a field with a series of passes at a lower application rate, which will allow time between the passes for the manure to soak into that consistent bed that's been established. So a producer is going to want to make sure that they're prepared for that level of activity prior to actually putting the manure on the ground. Second of all, they're going to want to maintain, as a safety precaution, extra setback distances from tile inlet structures, surface water streams, drainage ways. Their manure application plan should have identified those, and their field scouting, when they're out looking at the cracks in the fields, should identify those. And as an extra precaution, you want to maintain a safer setback. In addition to that, you'll want to check the drainage tile outlets, drainage ways, surface water bodies frequently during land application. And if any signs are noticed of manure reaching any of those water bodies or waterways, you'll want to stop manure application and move to other areas, and perhaps be prepared to respond in terms of removing any manures from those waterways. First of all, producers should also thoroughly review their emergency action plan. Again, hopefully every producer has one. If they don't, they're strongly encouraged to get an updated emergency action plan. And make sure that they have the necessary equipment and materials to respond to an unintended release of manure during land application, whether it be spillage, tipping a wagon en route to taking the manure to the field, or if after application or during application some signs of manure reaching a water body or a drainage way are noticed, that you have the equipment and materials necessary to appropriately respond to those releases. And so you'll want to make sure you do that. Second of all, aside from frequently checking water pathways during manure application, once it does rain, and it may be several days or a week or so after manure application, you'll definitely want to check those waterways again after the first significant rainfall that you receive, just to make sure that that has not washed any manure into the waterways.